Now we have our second presenter today ready, which is none other than Turo Uskali, Associate Professor and Head of the Journalism Program at the University of Juvaskylää in Finland. And Turo will be talking about satellite storytelling in journalism. So over to Turo.
So, thank you. So 5 years ago, I think we started to play with drones, and now I think we have ended to even a little bit more higher. And I'm talking about satellites and especially focusing on journalism. So let's take the second slide. So satellite journalism, in our definition, that is journalism that utilizes data collected by satellites as a source of information. And in this definition, it includes also the use of satellite imagery and other geospatial data produced by satellites, such as for mapping or location purposes. The next slide will sort of have a short summary of the history of how satellites and journalism have been playing together. So it all started already 1960s with Telstar, which was a American, British, and French collaboration. I mean, those countries' TV agencies worked together, and they enabled television programs to be sent across the Atlantic Ocean. But it was not, until 1980s that the inexpensive satellite links were available also for the news media. And I think the Atlanta-based cable news network known as CNN was one of the first who realized that this can be used also for news purposes, and they sort of started the 24/7 kind of news environment where we are living even now. So they started to use this inexpensive satellite links first for their domestic news production, and then later on for their international news productions. During the 1980s, there were many media companies which started to also, thinking about how about launching their own satellites. But at that time, it was too expensive, and this kind of initiatives like Mediasat was too expensive to put in practice. However, news media started to get satellite images from satellite providers and actually used in hundreds in news stories from 1985 to 1989, and of course since after. The next slide and the session will tell about the possibilities and pitfalls of using satellite images for journalistic purposes, and we start with pitfalls, of course. So 2003, there were a presentation at the United Nations by Secretary of State Colin Powell, who used satellite and other images as a proof of Iraq's lies about weapons of mass destruction. Of course, there were many other documents as well, and also audio tapes were there shown. But all these sort of try to demonstrate how Iraq was secretly developing massive destruction, weapons of mass destruction. And of course, at that time, the satellite images were very new, and they were almost uncritically taken by the journalist, and so it was just one of those documents that in hindsight proved to be wrong, and sort of were part of propaganda. So the next slide shows an example of after and before kind of comparisons, and this was during the Asian tsunami after that, and at that time it was really difficult to understand what was happening in those areas which were affected by the floods and the tsunami waves. But I think the satellite images were one of those first sort of documentations that indeed something very terrible has happened, and only afterwards the magnitude of the destruction was realized. The next slide tells that more recently, for example, ProPublica, which is an investigative reporting organization situated in New York, they were using among the very first this kind of archived satellite images for their investigative reporting stories about how the seaside of the Gulf of Mexico was rising all the time, and how this was affecting the people who were living and still are living in that area. And it was partly because of the drilling, the oil industry, and part of the climate change. So the next slide is also an example of a investigative reporting network. This is Bellingcat, situated in the UK. The downing of the Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was one of those first day stories where they used also satellite images in order to understand what was happening in eastern Ukraine. And later on, they have used satellite images in many other day stories as well. So the next slide, of course, one of the topics which will follow, sadly, in the near future for a long time is the climate crisis. And this images was taken from the New York Times, and it clearly shows us how the Antarctica is melting like never before. So just one image, one satellite image, will tell a lot of the story. And the next one, as we are living right now in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, this kind of before and after imagery can tell, for example, how in terms of air pollution the changes happened. At least for some time, the air pollution was less, for example, in China or in northern part of Italy. So you can, of course, insert special filters for those satellite cameras, and then you can go even more deeply to many areas, especially in terms of environmental reporting. The next slide tells about the story about Uyghur detention camps or concentration camps in China. It's very difficult to enter there as a journalist and to sort of report what is really happening there. So the satellite images can provide some evidence and documentation. And this story theme has been there already for several years, and there's every year actually there are some updated images coming from the satellite, and this story was feed some weeks ago, so giving us once again more evidence what's happening there. So the next slide, just briefly summarizing the satellite images used so far for mainly international reporting, crisis reporting, and investigative reporting, and mainly by major international news organizations. So those are even before being, the innovators and early adopters in terms of innovations in journalism. And the next slide will tell what is the situation right now. So there are almost 3,000 satellites already constantly circulating the orbit, and as many as 40 countries are there part of this kind of satellite activities. So there are plenty of satellite data sets available actually to all of us already, and they are really high resolution images. So even up to 30 centimeters. And there are several providers, for example, NASA, ESA, Maxar Technologies, Planet Labs are giving actually away satellite images for free, especially for journalistic purposes. And of course, international news agencies are constantly circulating satellite images related to timely news events. So, about the future predictions then. Well, there are at least two of those I want to mention here. The first one is that it seems that even the big players have started to use the satellite images already, and since 1980s, there is a great space for other news organizations as well to step in, and especially national and even maybe in regional levels. So the next slide will tell you one example from Norway, actually. Eli Frifludal, we interviewed him last autumn, and he told us a story when Wederskan was able to sort of use satellite images to understand what happened during the Ukrainian passenger jet crash in January 2020. And he used satellite images as well. And actually, they were able to reconstruct what happened there before, for example, New York Times, but they were sort of still hesitant to publish the stories. So they waited for the time that the New York Times had published the story, and then just minutes after, they also published their story on their website. But I think it's already possible that also this kind of national outlets will be the first ones to publish this kind of breaking stories about these kind of news events. The next slide will also say that there is a big bottleneck still in terms of using satellite images in newsrooms, and that's education and lack of education. And I think, like the next slide will show, that actually we are very close to that moment that we are able to create this kind of educational session. We made a pilot course in Juvaskylää last autumn. We had 20 master students, and they were participating in this kind of module. And after that course, they are now able to use satellite images in their stories. And we also tested this kind of education model online with the help of some pioneering Finnish newsrooms, and it worked nicely. And also, in the end of last year, we opened online course on satellite journalism, so everyone capable of reading Finnish can go there and do the course online. The next slide will offer some of those websites in English, which already can give some advice for how to start to use satellite images. So I think this is already a ubiquitous opportunity to all newsrooms and journalists to work with. So I think that was all from my part. Thank you.